There is no fairer scene in fair Connecticut than Ridgefield's Main Street, a mile or so of fine houses and velvety lawns, shaded by giant elms and maples. Cool, restful shadows, songs of birds, glimpses of sunny fields attract and charm the visitor, beguiling him into a fancy that this is some old world park rather than a thoroughfare in a New England village. Those words were written in 1908 for a magazine article on the town's 200th birthday. Hi, I'm Jack Sanders, and together we're going to take a walk down our fair Main Street a century or more ago, thanks to the magic of antique postcards. Almost all of the pictures you'll see are in color, which gives a better sense of what the town was like at the turn of the 20th century. First, a word about the postcards themselves. Since good color photography wasn't available then, printing a color picture of a scene required a bit of artistry. You'll see two kinds of cards, lithographed and hand-colored. The lithographed cards were all printed in Germany, which had the best technology for inexpensive color printing. They were mostly produced from around 1905 to 1914 and stopped when the war broke out in Europe. Lithography involved running the same picture through a press many times, one time for each color needed. A colorist would take a black and white picture and determine which features in the picture should be which colors, and the lithography technicians would then set up their presses to imprint the image as many as a dozen times to get the right coloring. Lithograph cards were replaced by hand-colored cards, almost all produced by the Brooklyn, New York company called Albert Type. Albert Type printed black and white pictures using a high-quality system called colotype. They then handed over the cards to artists. Using watercolors and brushes, the artists would hand paint each card. The card you see here, and we'll see on our walk later on, is hand-colored. It's pretty amazing considering that millions of these kinds of cards were produced by hand, as it were, at the Albert Type factory. I can only guess that a lot of starving artists made some extra cash working there. Our walk will take us from Casagmo, the old Casagmo estate, south to the very end of Main Street, a distance of about 1 1/3 miles. On the way, we'll take a peek down several side streets to see what was there back then. So that you won't get too tired, not from the hike, but from my blathering, we'll break the trip into 4 episodes. So let's begin episode 1. Here we are just south of the Casagmo entrance and looking north. It's the same entrance used today for the condominium community. This was the site of the Battle of Ridgefield, the skirmish between American soldiers and British troops who were on their way from burning Danbury to their ships at Westport. Just to the left of this scene is where General Benedict Arnold's horse was shot out from under him. At the lower right is the memorial built into the wall that George Alcott, the Casagmo owner, and his daughter Mary had erected in 1909. It says, "At the Battle of Ridgefield, April 27, 1777, died 8 patriots who were laid in these grounds, companioned by 16 British soldiers, living their enemies, dying their guests. In honor of service and sacrifice, this memorial is placed for the strengthening of hearts." A couple of 100 feet south of here, in December of 2019, the skeletons of 5 soldiers who died in the battle were unearthed in the basement of a house. The house had been built some years after the battle and the burials. The state archaeologist is having the skeletons studied by scientists and historians to confirm that they were the soldiers and possibly to determine whether they were British or American. At the right edge, you'll notice the caretaker's cottage for the Casagmo estate. It not only served as housing for staff, but, being at the entrance, probably also to discourage snoopers from entering the grounds, almost like a gatekeeper's cottage on a large old English estate. Let's cross the road and take a different look at this same scene. In this picture, we can see the front of the Casagmo mansion itself, built in 1892 after George Alcott tore down the historic saltbox-style Stebbins House, which had served as a hospital in the Battle of Ridgefield. His history-minded daughter, Mary, reportedly urged him not to destroy the house, but he did it anyway. The house is the origin of the name Casagmo. Casa in Italian means house, and GMO is the owner's initials. The house was built in an Italianate style. One wonders if Alcott had been fond of French-style houses, whether the place would have been called Maisonmo. But George liked things Italian. His son's daughter married an Italian count. The mansion was torn down in 1967 to make way for the 320 rental apartments that were built here and later converted to condominiums. Fortunately, the town required a 300-foot setback on any new construction, so what you see here today is largely wooded. While the first two pictures we've seen were hand-colored, this one is a German lithograph. Can you detect the difference? Let's cross back to the other side of the road and look south. In this view that we saw a few minutes ago, we get a good look at the majestic trees that once marched in long lines down each side of Main Street from just south of Casagmo. When they laid out Main Street, the town's founders made the right-of-way wide, very wide, about 130 feet wide. You can see here the width from the fence at the left to the stone wall at the right. Notice that the lines of trees were placed differently on each side of the road. On the east side, they are at the very east edge of the right-of-way, and there are no trees in the grassy strip between the sidewalk and the roadway. On the west side, the trees are all in the grassy strip. At the left edge is a short picket fence at the entrance of the Elms Inn. Across the street, at the right, you can see the porches on a house still standing at 531 Main Street. For many years, this was the home of Beth and Dr. Peter Yanity, and Dr. Yanity's dental practice. Back at the postcards time, it was the home and office of Dr. Russell W. Lau, a prominent physician and community leader for more than 50 years. Beyond it would be Ballard Park today, and Graylow, the Bigelow Ballard estate back then. We'll reach that shortly. This, incidentally, is a very early German lithograph. We can confirm its approximate age because it was postmarked April 29, 1905. Turning to the left, here's what the Elms Inn looked like back around 1930, or 1980, or 2010. It did not change much. Even today, converted into a condominium home, it looks much the same, except that the dining room wing on the left, an early 20th century addition, is gone. The building dates from 1760 and became an inn in 1860. Other buildings on the property also accommodated guests. The restaurant here became one of the great places to eat in Ridgefield. Among the people who dined there in the last half of the 20th century were actors Robert Redford, Paul Newman, Elizabeth Taylor, and Judy Garland, opera star Lily Pons, orchestra conductor Arturo Toscanini, and Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. As we move down the street, we'll see a view of the whole Elms complex. This image of the Elms cottages, as they were then called, is a German lithograph from very early in the color postcard era, probably soon after 1900. The building at the right was called the Elms Annex, but it was really a main location of rooms for guests. It is now part of the 16-unit condominium complex called, appropriately, the Elms. The Elms Inn was the next building to the left. Okay, let's turn around and see what's behind us. You're looking at what was once the center of today's Ballard Park, a historic house that, unfortunately, is no longer with us. This was the home of Colonel Philip Burr Bradley, commander of the 5th Connecticut Regiment in the Continental Army, and a leading citizen of the town and the state. It later became the home of Dr. Daniel Adams, known as Doc Adams, the physician and early baseball player who wrote many of the rules of modern-day baseball and whom some consider the founder of the sport. After Adams came Lucius Horatio Bigelow, a New York City music publisher whose specialty was hymns. He called his home Graylow, a name fashioned from his own name and his wife's maiden name. It can be seen on one of the gate's pillars today. His daughter, Elizabeth Bigelow Ballard, a pillar of the Garden Club and a founder of the Boys Club, gave the estate to the town in 1964 to be used as a park. But she felt that the house would be a burden on the community, so she provided money and orders for its demolition before the property was transferred to the town. Today, the park is one of the town's treasures and the scene of many outdoor concerts. Walking just 100 or so feet south and turning around to look back, we'd see a scene like this in 1930. Graylow, today's Ballard Park, is on the left, and the library is to the right. I love this picture because it's such a colorful portrayal of the magnificent trees that helped make Main Street attractive and fair for decades. It's also a nice image of Main Street itself when it was a concrete highway. Concrete is what the state used for almost all of its roads back when paving began. So when Main Street got its first pavement back in 1926, the roadway went from dirt brown to cement white. A half a century later, the state began using asphalt. When Main Street was repaved and got its first coat of blacktop around 1970, the surface went from dirty white to black and has stayed the same ever since. However, that concrete is still there under layers of asphalt. Since there is hardly any traffic, let's turn around and walk across to the middle of the beginning of Prospect Street and take a look at our brand new library. This is what our library looked like just a year or two after it was built in 1902. Its official name was the E.W. Morris Memorial Library, a gift of James Morris in honor of his wife Elizabeth, who died in 1899. James was a Manhattan attorney who spent a lot of time in Ridgefield, his summer retreat, and he loved the town and his wife. What's especially interesting about this view is that it clearly shows a strolling garden that had been installed behind the library. The garden seems not to have lasted very long because it doesn't show up in any subsequent postcard views. Today, of course, all that area is covered with the main library building. For the most recent version of the library, built between 2012 and 2014, all the brick construction from the 1950s to the 1980s, located to the east or right of this building, was removed and replaced with a larger, more open building. But fortunately, the old Morris building was retained and is today used for reading rooms. Since we are already in the middle of Prospect Street, let's head east a little and see an important piece of Ridgefield's past that came along after this picture was taken and is already gone. The Ridgefield Playhouse opened in 1940 as the town's first dedicated movie house. Before this, movies were shown in the town hall. The Playhouse was designed by John Eberson, who lived from 1875 until 1954 and was an architect famed for the development of movie palace designs. He did nearly 100 theaters across the United States, only a few of which still remain. The Playhouse was also used for a few other shows, such as Bond rallies during World War II, but the auditorium at Ridgefield High School, now called the Ridgefield Playhouse for Movies and the Performing Arts, was bigger and better for musical performances. Faced with declining numbers of moviegoers thanks to TV and competition from a new theater at Cops Hill Plaza, the Playhouse closed in 1973 and became a bank. The building was torn down in 2012, but the replacement, called the Prospector, has a facade virtually identical to the old playhouses. But inside, it has 4 movie theaters instead of just 1, and is operated largely by people with disabilities. Continuing down Depot Hill, we come to the Ridgefield Station and a train engine sticking its nose into Prospect Street. The tracks actually crossed the road and continued along the east edge of Lower Bailey Avenue, where there were warehouses and a freight terminal. For 55 years, from 1870 until 1925, the center of town had passenger rail service to this station. The trains made a 3.5-mile run between here and the main line in Branchville, where one could connect with trains to New York City or up to western Massachusetts and beyond. While passenger service ended in 1925, freight service lasted until 1964. For many years after the line was abandoned, the station served as a warehouse for the Ridgefield Supply Company. In 2016, the station was completely and accurately rebuilt a little west of where it used to be, and is today a showroom for Ridgefield Supply. Most of the abandoned track bed is now the Ridgefield Rail Trail. Now let's climb back up Depot Hill and look to the south. I've been told that this bearded gentleman was John Rockwell, the owner of the Elms Inn that we just saw. Why he's featured in a picture is anyone's guess, but later we'll see him again, only with his wife. He must have been sort of a celebrity with postcard buyers. As we look south from Prospect Street, we see this section of Main Street long before there were shopping centers at the right, now CVS, and the left, now Yankee Ridge. In fact, there were houses on both sides of the street here back then. This view is also before Lucius Bigelow of Graylow built the Tudor-style store and office Planet Pizza building beyond where the horse and buggy riders are. Speaking of the horse and buggy, you'll notice that all 4 legs of the horse are on the ground, suggesting that the buggy was stopped. The couple probably agreed to have their picture taken something the photographer, maybe Joseph Hartman, may have felt added life to the picture. It also adds balance. The right side of the photo would be pretty boring without them. It seems to have been at a time of the day and week when hardly anyone was in town. The usually busier village looks empty in the distance. Maybe they all had attended an early church service on a Sunday. All those trees over Rockwell's shoulder were near the Methodist Church complex at Main and Katuna Streets. Let's take a look at this area from across the street. We saw this wonderful hand-colored view at the beginning of the presentation. It's from around 1920. At the left is the store of Morris Gottlieb, who began his career in town by selling shoes from a push cart. Yes, push carts were used even in Ridgefield back then. Most sold produce. Soon, Gottlieb opened this store on Main Street, where he sold clothing as well as shoes. He eventually moved his business to Manhattan, where he became a successful merchant. The building in 2020, by the way, houses a taco restaurant. What's especially interesting about this image is how Gottlieb advertises his business with the equivalent of a billboard sign, painted right onto the siding of the building. This was a common practice nationally a century or more ago, though not so much in Ridgefield. Perhaps most stores here did not have the large, well-exposed space on which to paint a sign. Gottlieb did, and he took advantage of it, even shuttering windows so he'd have more uninterrupted space for words. The building's first floor was shared by Ridgefield Pharmacy, which was on the north or right side. Now for a closer look 10 or 15 years earlier. This close-up of the Gottlieb Ridgefield Pharmacy building is from around 1910. The Adams and Keeler real estate office in the middle was probably the town's main real estate operation back then. It may have been the only one. Adams and Keeler became Keeler and Durant Insurance and Real Estate, which operated for many years at the corner of Main and Governor Streets. In 1987, it merged with A.J. Carnell, which had become the biggest insurance office in town, and which later became part of Fairfield County Bank Insurance Services, which operates from the corner of Main and Katuna Street. So the ancestors of the Fairfield County Bank Insurance Services office have been on Main Street for more than a century. We've been told that the horse-drawn vehicle at the right was probably a hearse. Judging from the fancy dress of the driver, it may have been carrying at the time. Let's look at virtually the same scene only a few years later. Now automobiles dominate the street. The Adams and Keeler building has been replaced by a newer structure, housing J.W. Hibbert's Market, specializing in meat and fish. The Gottlieb Ridgefield Pharmacy storefronts are the same. Notice that both boys shown in this picture, one staring at the camera and the other just getting out of the car, are wearing collared shirts and ties, as well as knickers or knee pants. In the early 20th century, boys were encouraged to dress like men. That is, rather formally by today's standards. After World War I, tastes changed and kids' clothing became less formal. You may wonder about the boy getting out of the driver's side of the car. But back then, it wasn't the driver's side. Look closely and you'll see the automobile was right-hand drive. The 1908 Model T Ford was the first major left-hand drive car, but right-hand drive autos were still common until around 1915. Nonetheless, people drove on the right side of the road as they do today. Let's back up to where we were 3 pictures ago and swing our view a bit more directly south. You see a portrait of Ridgefield at a time of transition. In the distance are both horse and gasoline-powered vehicles. The horses would soon disappear from Main Street, and the automobiles would become all too numerous. Notice the prominent garage sign on Main Street. There were several garages and fueling stations in the center of town back in the 1920s. Lucius Bigelow's new store and office building is at the right, and of course is still there today. Back then it was officially known as the Telephone Building, because the phone company had its switchboards on the second floor. Ridgefield began telephone service in 1891 with 1 switchboard and 27 customers. If you look closely at the sidewalk in front of Gottlieb's, you'll see a boy standing next to a table with a man passing by him. We have not been able to figure out what the boy may have been doing there. Perhaps he was working for Gottlieb and selling something. Maybe he was a shoeshine boy without the chair for the customer to sit in. Let's walk south to beyond the telephone building and look across the street. The Gottlieb Ridgefield Pharmacy building is visible at the left or north edge of this picture from the late 1920s or early 30s. Then, from the left are Hibbert's Market, Conrad Rockline's barber shop, Joseph Roberts' contracting office, Charles Wade Walker's Happy Shop, and S.S. Denton's building, housing his offices and several stores. Walker's shop featured, as he put it, toys to make the kiddies happy, sweets to make the ladies happy, and smokes to make the men happy. Denton, one of the town's wealthiest businessmen, had his office where that second-story projection is. He had that built so that he could snoop on what was going on up and down Main Street. It was removed years ago, but the little eyebrow window above it is still there, as is the signboard without Denton's name. Incidentally, this is an example of a cheaply done hand-colored postcard, something found in the late 20s and early 30s, produced by a company called A.M. Simon. Several were done at the center of town. Here we will end part 1 of our walk. In the next episode, we will explore the very center of town a century ago.